Hello, everyone. Today, I want to talk a little bit about a slightly more heavier topic, and that is discussing the various different sources of evil. Now, the reason why it's important to talk about the evil and its various different sources is because the question often arises as to why it seemingly is always easier to do the wrong thing than the right thing. It seems as though we all exist under a sense of metaphysical or spiritual gravity, where it's easier to fall down than it is to build up. It's easier to do what's wrong than it is to do what's right. And what are the impinging forces that seemingly make that difficult? Well, within the Bible, there's basically been three major categories that have been identified and summarized. In the past, these were articulated very well by theologians like Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard. But the idea is that, and they derived these summaries from passages like the Gospel of Matthew or the St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians. But these major categories are been summarized that are all described throughout the Bible as being the world, the flesh, and the devil. Now, there are a number of different ways in which it's described, but basically those three categories, the world, the flesh, and the devil, wind up being the sources. They would describe it as the sources of temptation, but really these are three sources of evil with which we all have to contend. Now, what are these? Well, simply put, the world is, in each of these in succession, the world is what you would describe as collective malevolence. Somehow, in the mystery of the humanity, none of us is as bad as all of us. It's a historic reality that collectively, when we work together, we're able to achieve evils that any individual find it more difficult to conjure. So, if you look at, say, for example, the Holocaust of Nazi Germany, the Bolshevik starvation of kulaks, the Japanese rape of Nanking in China, or the Rwandan genocide. These are examples of where we somehow are able to collectively shed our humanity and achieve cruelties that are not attested in the rest of the animal kingdom. So evolutionary explanations alone can't account for it. So somehow we're able to work together to perform evils that any one of us individually might find difficult to actually get beyond, say, conscience or shed our humanity to that degree. But I mean, a lot of the major atrocities throughout the 20th century and before that, in many ways, were able to be achieved simply by bureaucrats with the pen signing orders for things that didn't affect them very much, if at all. So there's a sense of collective malevolence when the Bible talks about the world as the world system as being something with which you must contend if you're trying to do what's right, if you're trying to pursue the requirements and the design of God in both in your life and in society. So the world is one source of evil with which we must contend. But then if the world is collective malevolence, then there's what's referred to as the flesh. The flesh is autogenic malevolence. We're able to produce evils all on our own without any outside help. It's seeming like we are able to self-generate a lot of the destructive power that it can undo ourselves in many ways. We don't need any outside training to perform much of our sinful instincts. Two people that you have really don't have much difficulty convincing of the historic doctrine of original sin are people who work in law enforcement and people who work in daycares. Because especially those who work with early childhood education and early childhood development, because they'll find that sometimes when little Johnny pulls little Susie's hair just to enjoy the reaction he got from her, he didn't have to, it isn't always as a result of some tumultuous home life. It isn't a result of conditioning or some sort of genetic abnormality. He simply enjoyed watching the reaction, the distress that he caused the other little girl when he pulled her hair at a young age. And this is the type of thing you can see, well, okay, kids don't have to be trained to sin. We're able to produce that all on our own. And from the earliest ages, we see that for whatever reason, mysteriously, we can generate our own evil without any outside help. These are, for that very reason, we teach people like the classic virtues that are things that are positive behaviors and attitudes they should pursue. Think of the deadly sins that have been described in ancient classic literature as well. Things like pride and wrath and gluttony and lust. We're able to produce these things all on our own without any outside help. They can be exacerbated and helped along by surroundings and peers that are all failing to offer any sort of um, uh, you check or balance and making us stop what we're doing or think a better way. With the right conditions, we can exacerbate our own vices this way, but we're able to produce all that by ourselves with any outside help. It's autogenic malevolence. But then the third category is the devil, which is sentient malevolence. Now, in the modern era, this is one of the things that everyone loved to kind of dismiss as being passé and ancient and go, oh my goodness, of all those superstitions, we've left those behind. But that was to our detriment, because we see that there is spiritual reality and spiritual forces that are bent on human destruction that are not divine or human in their origin. Whether you want to get in the etymology of where the name Satan comes from or Lucifer in the Bible, this is largely an unhelpful path to go down. It's clear that all of divine revelation, all of the sacred text, teaches this category of spiritual forces that are sentient, malevolent, and able to have some sort of influence within the world that we operate in. Has Hollywood somewhat offered something of a dismissible caricature with sensationalizing demonic forces in many possession movies? Sure, but even though those caricatures exist and sometimes are dramatizing them in ways that we don't consider to be applicable to us, it still is to our detriment to ignore it altogether, because it's clearly taught throughout the Bible that these forces exist and they attempt to have sway and be something of an active agent in the various different ways that we fall short of the requirements and design of God in our lives. But so there you have the world, the flesh, and the devil, which is collective malevolence, autogenic malevolence, and sentient malevolence. Now, all these three are somewhat distinct, but that doesn't mean they're separable. There's considerable overlap. Pick your favorite Venn diagram, and you will see that the overlap between them means that the distinction doesn't negate their independent contribution to what we all struggle with. Demonic influences and peer pressure may come to bear on an individual. That doesn't take away their responsibility for their actions and their attitudes at all. In like manner, individuals can have something of a demonic temptation to follow along, but it's the state that's producing some sort of bureaucratic genocide that we all just follow along with, and then those individuals still bear the responsibility for how much they participated in that. In like manner, there may be some cultural conditions and peer pressures that that influence someone to possibly seek the occult or be open to some sort of demonic influence, but the individual still chose to dabble in something you ought not to do, because the Bible clearly forbids fooling around with malevolent forces that are not divine, because you cannot control the extent to which they will continue their influence with you. All these come together, and again, that doesn't negate the distinction of each and how these individual categories have to be accounted for within the life of the faithful. But there is considerable overlap there. For reasons which seem good to him, God allows these to exist. And speculation as to why they've been allowed to exist is seldom helpful. I know that there's a portion of philosophy, theodicy, that tries to account for why God allows these to exist and in essence, defend God's honor. I've never found that to be particularly helpful, because that isn't how is that going to affect daily life? We know, though, regardless of whether or not how it is you wind up explaining that God allows this to exist, we know that he always has left himself ready and available as the cure. So even though it may not be to our benefit to try to speculate as to why it is this evil is allowed to continue, we know that God allows it to continue until such time that he won't. There must be a shelf life as to when that these evil forces are allowed to operate. In fact, that's one of the promises of the Holy Scriptures, is that there is a shelf life there, and eventually they will be done away. In the meantime, though, God allows himself and always available as the cure in Jesus Christ. For that reason, even though some its speculation isn't to our benefit, seeking him for the cure always is. Because these categories, while not particularly articulated this way, are found from all the way through the Bible, going back to the earliest text, even in Genesis. In a reverse order of the world, the flesh, and the devil, in reverse order, each of these showed up in the earliest text in Genesis as being actors in some of the earliest accountings of human destruction. The devil is present in the story of the first garden as an actor who's tempting the original couple to reach for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil being a divine prerogative, and they're just going to grasp that for themselves. Thank you. So the devil is a tempting actor in that scene. And then you see the flesh coming out later on when two brothers are interacting in between Cain and Abel's sacrifice is received and his brother's is not. And so that resentment that fosters over differential blessing starts to well up within Cain, and he rises up and kills his brother as a result. That murderous instinct that comes over resentment and envy, that's something of a microcosm of many of the Marxist genocides that we saw throughout the 20th century. And then later on, you see the world taking, it really as an actor, that type of world system really seen in impinging on human destruction. As you see later on, both in the stories related to Noah's Ark, where collective malevolence has spread across the known world at the time, but also in the Tower of Babel story, where it seems as though in that story, people are so committed and so cooperative in their own rebellious acts toward God, and they are so effective at their collective capacity to go against God at the time, that his view is, unless I confuse all these languages, they're headed down an ability to self-destruct much faster than we want. So that story is used as a narrative to explain as to that confusion of language really disperses people. But nevertheless, regardless of how you take those stories, they are present in the earliest writings as explaining or showing how the world, the flesh, and the devil all come together as overlapping sources of evil bent toward human destruction. And for this reason, we always have to keep these in account. And the faithful will think about them soberly and how you have to deal with these things as one strives to be a follower of Jesus Christ. That's all I have for today. God bless you. If you enjoyed this content, please hit like and subscribe, and we will keep it up.